Hello, everybody. Welcome to Nonprofit University. Today, we're going to be covering the statement of functional expenses. My name is Kyle Robbins, and I am an audit partner at Larson Company, local CPA firm that specializes in assisting nonprofit organizations with their financial service needs, including audits, reviews, compilations, 990 prep, and all those things. So let's get into this training and talk through the statement of functional expenses. So in this training, we're going to cover a couple of things. We're going to, first of all, give an overview of functional expense reporting. We're going to go through program services specifically, talk through some of those things. And then we're going to also cover supporting activities. And then finally, we'll go through the accounting for expenses by function. So let's get into this and go through the overview of functional expense reporting. So not-for-profit entities, they're kind of pressured to devote a lot of their time and expenditures to accomplishing their mission and programs. So that's kind of primarily what nonprofits are started and organized for, is their mission. And so there's that pressure to ensure your expenses and time are going towards fulfilling that mission. So while it is an ideal goal of a non-for-profit, there is also the consideration for management activities and how those activities are also necessary to effectively operate a nonprofit. But then there's also the fundraising aspect of things too, where a nonprofit can't continue to operate if they don't have the funding that they need to continue operating. So there's the program activities, and then there's the management activities, and then there's the fundraising activities. And honestly, they're all necessary and important for a nonprofit to function and fulfill its mission. But oftentimes the focus of donors or others that review financial statements is specifically on the program activities. So it is important to consider these other things. There's even agencies out there that rate the effectiveness of nonprofits, and they'll oftentimes look at expense ratios that they look at the statement of functional expenses, and they'll look at the ratio of the expenses that are going towards programs. And they kind of say, oh, the higher that number is, the more effective this nonprofit is, which can be adds pressure, but it can be a negative thing too, because if that's what they're focusing on, they're not fully getting the big picture of, the management expenses and general expenses and fundraising expenses. They're important too. And so it is important to keep that in mind, but you also need to remember that, these agencies are looking at program activities expenses. So just be aware that that monitoring is out there, and something that people are paying attention of. All right, so continuing the overview. So all nonprofits are required to report information about their expenses in one location. And that can be on a statement of functional expenses on its own. It can be on the statement of activities, kind of just as part of the statement of activities and broken out a little bit more. Or it can also be included in the notes to the financial statements. Regardless of the location that this is provided and broken out, it is required. And the relationship between the functional classification of expenses and the natural classification of expenses should be presented. It should be disaggregated and kind of broken out in those classifications. So it is an important thing. It is a required thing, both in the financial statements and also in the 990. It's important to note too, if there are any voluntary help and welfare entities out there, those entities are required to have a statement of functional expenses. So while the accounting standards say it can be in the statement of functional expenses, it can be in the statement of activities, or it can be in the notes, if you are a voluntary help and welfare entity, you do need to have a statement of functional expenses, so a separate statement, and not have it broken out in the notes or in the statement of activities. So just something to note there and remember. So FASB, which is the accounting standards kind of setting board, they set the accounting standards. They have a glossary that provides some definitions. So as we've talked a little bit about functional classification, talked a little bit about natural classification, kind of what does that actually mean? So the functional classification, it's just a method of grouping expenses according to the purpose for which the costs are incurred. So the functional classification is kind of the breakout in the columns. So breaking it out by program, by management in general, or by fundraising. That's the functional classification. That's what that means. So program services. So those are the activities that result in goods and services being distributed to beneficiaries, customers, or members that are directly fulfilling the purpose of the not-for-profit. So those direct expenses that are directly fulfilling the mission of the organization or the programs of the organization, those are your program services and program service expenses. Some other definitions here. So supporting activities. So those are all activities that a not-for-profit has that are other than the program services. So these generally will include your management and general activities, your fundraising activities, and then also for membership organizations that they could also have these membership development activities. So the supporting activities are those that are supporting the organization and helping the organization fulfill their mission, but they're not going directly to those programs or directly to the mission. All right, so let's talk a little bit about program services. So the program services, so the number of programs will vary organization to organization, kind of just depending on the not-for-profit. Some nonprofits have one program that they focus on and fulfill. Other nonprofits have multiple programs that they're fulfilling as part of their overall mission. And so each of those programs are considered a program service or a program activity. And so all nonprofits incur costs and provide services for their different programs that they've identified. The components of total program expenses should be reported either on the face of the statement of activities or in the notes to the financial statements. And so that's important to remember. And then many nonprofits will report more than one program service depending on their size and complexity. Kind of already briefly mentioned that. And so it is important to be able to be tracking those expenses separately within your organizations, making sure that you're breaking out your program expenses by program depending on the number of programs you have, just so you can clearly identify and report on those expenses and what expenses are going to which programs. It helps for those financial statement users that are reading your financial statements, but also for internal purposes, just making sure you're tracking those and understanding where your expenses are going and what programs you're focusing on. All right. Also, just nonprofits do have some latitude in defining their major programs so that the information provided is meaningful in understanding your expenses. So some factors to consider in determining the programs to present just include the program objectives, the nature of the services, the constituents served, and that can be by geographic or other demographic criteria, the magnitude of the program to the nonprofit's overall activities, budgeting categories, just some other things. So there's a lot of things to consider. Some factors might be more or less significant than others, just depending on your organization. And so as you're determining which programs to kind of focus on and identify and report on, you do want to make sure that the major ones are being broken out and tracked. If you have several programs that are smaller, it is okay to kind of combine those as other program activities in your reporting. But the major ones you do want to have broken out. And also for 990 purposes, So the organization's Form 990 does have additional reporting requirements for program services. And so as you're doing your financial statement reporting and your 990 reporting, it is appropriate and okay to be comparing those two and making sure that they line up together. There may be some differences here and there for tax purposes and accrual reporting purposes type of thing, but typically you can try to make those line up and reflect each other. So there's not confusion there when people are looking at both of those. All right, let's talk through some supporting activities. So the supporting activities, as mentioned before, these include your management in general, your fundraising, and then membership and development activities. So each has a specific definition, and we're going to kind of go through those a little bit. So the management and general activities, those are activities that are not identifiable with a single program, fundraising activity, or membership development activity, but they are indispensable to conduct those activities and to the entity's existence. So it's essentially everything that doesn't go into these other categories would go into the management and general activities. So some examples of these are kind of for general oversight of the organization, the business management, general record keeping, kind of bookkeeping, accounting, audit services, 990 prep services, budgeting, soliciting funds other than contributions. So if you're soliciting contributions specifically, that's going to go into fundraising. Making announcements concerning appointments, producing and disseminating the annual report. So just type of things that are necessary to do in the organization, but don't directly benefit or fulfill the mission of the organization. All right. And then entities do need to be careful when assessing costs that appear to be supporting a program, but should be correctly classified as a supporting activity. So this happens quite often where some expenses will be put into program activities just because it happens. So for example, for like a nonprofit symphony. So if a nonprofit symphony is advertising to sell tickets for an upcoming concert, it is considered advertising under the standards, even though the actual concert itself is a program-related expense. So the expenses to actually put on the concert and have it happen and is a program activity. But the advertising aspect, by advertising, you're not fulfilling your mission because the advertising itself is not what is providing that benefit type of thing. The ticket sales activities are neither program services nor fundraising because ticket sales are not contributions. So because ticket sales are not contributions, it's not considered a fundraising activity to kind of promote the ticket sales. Yeah, so that's an example there. Let's see. Fundraising activities are activities undertaken to induce potential donors to contribute money, securities, services, materials, etc. So the fundraising activities themselves are what are the expenses that are raising contributions to the organization. So whether, and it is important to note too, that whether or not the intended donor responded favorably to that solicitation doesn't determine where it should be classified. So if if you had the fundraising activity, you had the expense, the donor didn't end up donating a contribution, it's still considered to be a fundraising activity and a fundraising expense, just because that was the intent of the expense. It's also important to think about if a nonprofit has a lot of contributions, it's pretty unusual for that nonprofit to have minimal or no fundraising expenses because there's got to be some kind of activity going on to generate those contributions. So we just keep that in mind. The more contributions a nonprofit has, the more likely they are to have higher fundraising expenses. Okay, just some additional descriptions of fundraising activities for you. There's publicizing and conducting fundraising campaigns, maintaining donor mailing lists, conducting special fundraising events, preparing and distributing fundraising manuals, instructions, and other materials, conducting other activities involved with soliciting contributions from individuals, foundations, government agencies, etc. So just some things to keep in mind there. Okay. All right, some specific examples of management and general activities. We talked about these already. Cut this out. All right, so some membership development activities, those include soliciting for prospective members and membership dues, membership relations, and similar activities. So although these are less common, mostly going to be in membership organizations. But yeah, and then just some other supporting activities include costs of sales activities that are not program, expenses of owning and maintaining an investment property. Those are going to be non-program related. And then payments to local and national nonprofits that cannot be allocated to other functional categories. So like a payment, if you're a nonprofit that is part of a national nonprofit and you have payments you have to make, that is not going to be a program activity because you're not directly benefiting or using those expenses to fulfill your mission. It's just an expense. It is a required expense, but it's an expense that would be considered supporting because it's not directly benefiting. So, all right. Let's talk a little bit about the accounting for expenses by function now. So with the allocation of expenses, the preferred method for allocating your expenses is definitely going to be the direct identification. And that's typically going to be the easiest just because if you have an expense that is 100% direct to a specific activity, that's easy to identify, easy to track, and easy to be able to show and say, this expense was 100% towards that specific program. There's some other things. If an expense can be specifically identified with a program, it should be assigned to that function. So an example of that is travel costs incurred in connection with a program activity that can 100% be assigned to that program. In other cases, in a lot of cases, expenses relate to more than one program or supporting activity, or it can be a combination of program and supporting services. So the cost allocation method that you use in allocating these costs across the different areas, it should be rational, it should be systematic, and it should result in an allocation of costs that is reasonable, and it should be something that you can apply consistently, given similar facts and circumstances each year. So it's important for certain expenses that are going to apply every year to different areas. It's important to come up with a set methodology that you're going to follow, a set kind of process that you're going to follow in allocating those expenses, and kind of come up with the estimates you use for those allocations, whether it be payroll is an easy example of this, where for payroll, you're gonna allocate things based on the time. So if you have your executive director, their salary and wages, and you want to determine how to allocate those, because a lot of times the executive director is going to be spread across the different areas. They're going to have some program service areas that they're specifically working on. They're going to have management in general. They're going to have fundraising. And so it's important to come up with a method to allocate that time. And the best approach for that is going to be based on their time, just determining what percentage of their time they typically spend in a specific area. And I mentioned about being consistent and making sure that you're applying that consistently. In those cases, it's appropriate to assess that allocation percentage and to kind of reevaluate that as time passes, because one year they could spend it one way, and the next year they could be allocating their time across different areas in a different way. So it is okay. You do want to be consistent, and kind of the consistency there is you're using time and effort. And then you're evaluating that time and effort each year based on the kind of your best estimate of what they're spending their time on, unless you have it tracked in your time software where they're spending their time. Then that's kind of an easy way to be able to track that, but not all organizations are able to do it that way. So, all right, continuing on with allocation of expenses, some specific guidance to consider when allocating costs. These are some accounting standards that you could access or follow. If you don't have access to these standards, feel free to reach out and we can kind of provide that information to you to read through. But each of these sections is specific in the nonprofit industry section of the accounting standards. So there's some general guidance. There's some guidance on allocation of occupying and maintaining a building. And then there's also guidance on allocation of interest costs as well. So yeah, feel free to look that up yourselves. Or if you aren't able to have access to that, feel free to reach out. We can help provide some additional guidance there. All right, we've kind of mentioned a little bit natural classification. I haven't got too much into that yet. So we've talked about the functional classification, which goes, programs supporting fundraising. The natural classification piece is that nonprofits are also required to present the functional expenses by the type of expense that they are. So, for example, salaries, rent, utilities, interest expense, office supplies, depreciation, and these are also kind of broken out in the 990 as well. So, and our firm, we typically try to follow as closely as we can the 990 breakouts and try to keep those two reports consistent with each other. In this case, we do have a PDF that we can provide to clients that kind of has these natural classifications from the 990, what the 990 has broken out, and a description of what type of expenses would typically go into each of those classifications. So that's a resource that we can provide to you if you would like some additional guidance there as far as what type of expenses to have broken out in your 990. And so, yeah, like I mentioned, that can be provided upon request. Feel free to reach out and we can send that PDF your way. Here's an example of the statement of functional expenses, just a high level. So you can see here in this example, there's two separate programs that are broken out. There's general administrative, and then there's fundraising that has the total expenses to the far right. Anytime you have expenses that are included with revenue, you do typically include those in the statement of functional expenses, but then you would want to reduce those out at the bottom there, just so that it's not being double recorded in the statement of activities, because typically the total functional expenses at the bottom of this report will agree to your expenses on your statement of activities, and so any expenses that are included with revenue need to be reconciled out of this report. Some examples of that are if you have a special event and there's some expenses that are directly benefiting donors. So a donor goes to this event and they receive something in return for just being at the event, but that's something that the nonprofit paid for, and it's an expense. That expense would typically be included up in revenue with the special events revenue, and it would net out that amount. And so that's one specific example of an expense that that's included with revenue that you would reduce here. So like in this example here, you can see there's that 20,000 coming out of fundraising. That's most likely probably because of a special event and the expenses going into that fundraising activity. Okay, yeah, so that's going to be our quick statement of functional expense training. Hopefully not too time consuming, but provide some information on the statement of functional expenses for you. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at Larson Company. This slide here provides some additional information for you. There's our website that you can go to, and there's a way to reach out on the website, submit a question, or anything else. There's also my email address there as well. So if you want to reach out directly to me, I'm happy to answer any questions you have on statement of functional expenses or any other questions you may have nonprofit related. And I can also provide that PDF that we have that breaks out those 990 expenses by line. So thank you very much for joining our training today. We look forward to hearing from you. Look forward to you joining the other trainings we have, the other training videos we have posted here. Thank you.